Well, hi everyone. This week you have really a short reading compared to other weeks, so I hope you'll enjoy that. And videos like these will be intended to sort of prepare you for your reading so that you have a good idea of what to be looking for and in some cases to suggest some questions that you ought to be asking yourselves as you read. Now, both the readings for this week, both in West in the World and Art Across Time, have to do with what we call prehistory. Now, the name itself, prehistory, is a kind of misnomer because we can talk about the history of prehistory. In the prehistorical period, people lived, history was made, and so on. So, yes, it's a misnomer, but why do we use this term, prehistory? What is the difference between prehistory and the historical period? Well, the answer is actually quite simple, and that is we refer to the period of prehistory because during this period there was no writing. Not only do we not have writing from this period, but it would appear that there was no writing going on at all. So we can try to reconstruct what happened during this period of time, and that's what historians do. They try to reconstruct that. But unlike most other periods of human history, there are no texts to draw from. There are only artifacts. So we can say some things about how prehistorical people lived, what their cultures were like, but we always have to remember that our knowledge is severely limited by not only the complete absence of texts, but also by the randomness and ambiguity of the archaeological remains that we possess, right? So we happen to have some archaeological remains, but of course other objects and artifacts have been destroyed or have not been discovered yet or will never be discovered. And then what we do have, the objects that we do have, we'll talk about art in just a moment, we don't always know what to make of them. And you could look at an artifact from the Stone Age and you could maybe offer 5 different interpretations of what that thing actually is and what it was for, its purpose. So we have to be very careful, very cautious, making any kind of claims about this period, prehistory. But there are some things that we can know and things that we can learn. So we'll focus on those things where we're on firmer ground. And I just do want to say a brief word about the whole historical enterprise because we're doing a lot of history in this class, and I think it's worth thinking just for a moment about what that is, what history actually is. History is not the same thing as the past. The past is the total aggregate of all things that have ever happened in human history. We can't actually recover most of what's happened in human history. We can only recover a pretty small fraction of that. So when we talk about history, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about our reconstruction of the past, which is always going to be based on limited evidence. Evidence that falls, as I've already said, into 2 main categories. Written evidence, text, and that can be everything from epic poems to grocery lists, and artifacts, objects. This can include everything from skeletons to sculptures. Now, what historians do is not simply, although there's nothing simple about it, is not simply gathering evidence, gathering text and objects and artifacts and then sort of looking at them. But rather, doing history requires interpretation, interpretation of text, interpretation of objects and artifacts. And so to do good history, you really need an active imagination, because these objects and texts that the historian studies, they don't interpret themselves. They need to be interpreted. The historian needs to be able to imagine what these texts might have meant, or how these objects might have been used, and so on. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind about the very project of doing history at all. Okay, well, one of the things that I hope to accomplish in these videos is to give you a sense of the big picture. So, if you want to do really well on our quizzes and essays and things like that, you do need to know some details. But before you can really make sense of details, you have to have a sense of the larger picture, of the larger framework. So let's just say that for this week, what we are focused on is not just sort of prehistory in general, but a period, very long period of time, known as the Stone Age. And indeed, the Stone Age is typically divided into 2 or more subdivisions. We're going to stick with the 2 subdivision scheme, because we're going to talk about the Paleolithic period, the Old Stone Age, and the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age. I realize Art Across Time introduces the concept of the Mesolithic. I'm going to say, don't worry about that. Let's just focus on the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Okay? Both belong to the Stone Age. Both are part of this thing we call prehistory. So in this video, from this point on, I'm simply going to talk a bit about Paleolithic and then move on to Neolithic. And in both cases, I will raise some questions about culture in general, and then also about art in particular. So be prepared for that. And it's always a good idea, whatever text I'm talking about, whatever reading it is that I'm talking about in these videos, to have those readings open in front of you as you're listening and as you're taking notes. And of course, you do want to take notes. And there will be things that I will talk about in these videos that will not necessarily be there in your texts. Your assigned text will not necessarily be presented in one of the lecture videos. We don't have one of those. Well, we have one of those this week, but you usually have 1 or 2. But there will be some things taken specifically and exclusively from these little videos that I make that will end up on the quiz. And I may also say things from time to time that would be suitable to include in an essay. So keep that in mind. All right, Paleolithic. Let's date it, first of all. And it gets a little messy because your 2 textbooks date it slightly differently. I'm going to go with the West in the World scheme. And I'm going to say Paleolithic is the period of time from 600,000 BC to about 10,000 BC. Now, these dates are really rough and approximate, but they give us a starting point. I want to say 2 quick things about dates here. The first is that you may have noticed in your textbooks that they use a dating scheme that you may or may not have seen before. It's the BCE CE scheme. BCE stands for before the Common Era. CE stands for Common Era. Now, the good news is that if this is new to you, it's very simple, dead simple, in fact, to transfer dates from the BC AD scheme to the BCE CE scheme. So, if something happened in 100 BC, before Christ, it's also going to be 100 BCE. Obviously, BCE is a less specifically Christian form of dating, which is why some people have adopted it. Likewise, CE is always perfectly equivalent to AD. So if something happened in the year 1000 AD, it's 1000 CE. So it's simple. And I will probably occasionally use one dating scheme and then use another. I don't have a strong preference myself. If you have a strong preference, that's fine. But you do need to be aware that a number of scholars today use the BCE CE scheme. So when you see that, I don't want you to be bewildered by it. The other thing to say about dating is that I'm perfectly aware that there are differences of opinion among people about things like the age of the earth, the age of the human race. My job is not to try to convince you for the truth, convince you of the truth of one of those schemes. You may not believe that the earth is 600,000 years old. That's fine, but I do think it's very important to understand, to know what the majority of scholars think. Okay? So the majority of scholars, historians, archaeologists, and so on, believe that there is a period of human history called the Paleolithic period. It stretches from 600,000 to 10,000. So even if you have objections to those dates, I think you need to be aware that those dates are generally accepted. All right, well, as you read, one of the main questions you want to be able to answer is, what are the main features of Paleolithic culture? In other words, people who lived during this period of time, what were the main features of their lifestyle, for lack of a better word? So what kind of communities did they live in? Were they stationary communities? Were they nomadic communities? What did people eat? What was their diet like? How did people procure food for themselves? What kind of societies existed in the Paleolithic period? Did you have a number of different social classes, from the very rich to the very poor? Or were most people living at basically the same sort of social level? West in the World will answer most of those questions for you, so be looking for that as you read. I want to spend a bit more time, though, talking about Paleolithic art. Again, after all, the only way we really know anything at all about Paleolithic people is through their art. And I'm using art as a very broad category that encompasses not only things like sculpture and painting, but any kind of artifact. We do have some sculptures from the Paleolithic period. Perhaps the most famous is the so-called Venus of Willendorf. Okay, it was discovered in Willendorf, Germany, so that's how it got the name. So you'll want to look at that. It's on Art Across Time, page 29. One of the things that you'll notice about this sculpture, and you'll find this also in the cave paintings, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is a kind of blend of abstract and representational elements. Okay, so if you want to talk about what Paleolithic art was like, what were its artistic characteristics, I think you have to talk about this. Because on the one hand, if you look at the Venus of Willendorf, it is unmistakably a woman, right? You don't look at the Venus of Willendorf and say, well, is that like a dolphin or something like that? No, it's a woman, no question about that. But of course, it's heavily exaggerated, heavily stylized. Okay? This figure is just sort of made up of a series of geometrical shapes in a way that actual human beings are not. Okay? So that's what I'm talking about when I say that the art of this period has some abstract elements, elements that are not really quite lifelike. But at the same time, this art is representational because it is representing, copying forms from the material world around us. Now, one of the questions that you have to confront when you look at something like the Venus of Willendorf is what was this for? Okay. The idea of art for art's sake is a relatively new concept, and you should never simply assume that anybody is making art simply to be enjoyed, simply to be looked at and appreciated as an artistic object. No, usually, especially in the ancient world, something else is going on. There is some kind of function, there is some kind of purpose. So what could that be? And your textbook will help you think about some of the options. But why would somebody make an object like the Venus of Willendorf? Why would somebody want to have it? Why would somebody want to have it in their possession? Of course, the very name Venus of Willendorf, the Venus part anyway, suggests that perhaps this figurine represented a kind of goddess, a kind of fertility goddess. That's a possibility, but that's an interpretation, right? Because archaeologists didn't discover this figurine with a little caption explaining what it was. That would be impossible, right? Because there's no writing at this time. So we have to interpret. So those are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself as you look at art from this period. The other main form of Paleolithic art that we possess are the famous cave paintings of Spain and France, places like Lascaux, Chauvet, and so on. Don't worry so much about which paintings are in which particular cave. Again, that's going to be an ongoing challenge in this course. You want to grasp the big picture. You want to have some significant details at your fingertips, but at the same time, you don't want to sort of over memorize things. Okay, so don't worry so much about the different caves. Instead, focus on the general features, the general characteristics of cave art. That includes artistic features, so it simply is works of art. What could we say about the cave paintings? And in particular, what can we say about that question we raised a moment ago? Is this representational art primarily? So you look at it and you immediately know what you're looking at. Is this abstract art? Or is this art a blend of the two, of the abstract and the representational? I'll give you a not so subtle hint and say it's the last option. It's a blend. You need to be able to explain why that is so. Right? What is representational about cave paintings? What is realistic about them? But on the other hand, what is also sort of abstract and unrealistic about them? And again, the next big question to be raised is, why did these people create these paintings? They had to go deep into caves, and they would do this year after year after year for a very, very long time. Why did they do this? What was the point? Perhaps it was just for sheer enjoyment. And I do think it's worth dwelling on the fact for a moment that before human beings built cities, before they came up with writing, before any of that, human beings made art. And that, I think, tells us something about what it means to be human, which of course is what this class is all about. So, it's fine to say, well, they enjoyed making the art, they enjoyed looking at it, and so on. But I think it's highly likely that there was even more going on. And so, again, look to your textbook, familiarize yourself with some of the theories about what exactly these Paleolithic people were up to when they went deep into those caves and made those amazing paintings. I should also say there's a movie, a documentary called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams that last time I checked was available on Netflix. That may not be true anymore, but it's a documentary about cave paintings, and it's pretty interesting and worth a look. That's totally optional, but that's something that you might want to check out. Okay, so I want to move on now to the Neolithic period. So again, different scholars might date it a bit differently. I think we can stick with 10,000 BCE to 3,000 BC. I think that'll work just fine. And I just can't stress enough how kind of arbitrary these dates are, so it's not like somebody who lived in 9,999 BC lived a wildly different life from somebody who lived in 10,100 BC or something like that. So these historical changes are very gradual, sometimes even imperceptible, and they happen at different times in different places. So not every culture is going to sort of enter the Neolithic period at the same time. And that brings me to, I think, the main thing you need to know about Neolithic. What makes Neolithic different from Paleolithic? What is the big change? The big change is quite simply agriculture. Okay? Domesticating plants and animals, which was not done in the Paleolithic period. And I think it's pretty obvious and not very surprising that some people are going to sort of develop agriculture earlier than other people will. So it's worth knowing a bit about one of the earliest places that enters the Neolithic, which is the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. So be sure to have some sense of why the Fertile Crescent becomes one of the first places where agriculture is developed, and therefore it becomes one of the first places where the Neolithic period begins. So be able to answer that question. Agriculture, of course, is going to have any number of far-reaching repercussions for human beings, not least the fact that human beings are now going to start living in settled communities. In some cases, settled communities of fairly good size, maybe a couple of thousand people. You could find villages like that in the Neolithic period, villages like Jericho, which comprised about 2,000 people over 12 or so acres. So we can't call them cities, that would be misleading, but we could call them villages, maybe even towns. I think it's quite easy for us in some ways to think about positive developments that stem from agriculture. I think most of us would see the invention of agriculture as a good thing on the whole, and I'm not disputing that. But I think as you read, especially West in the World, you'll come to see that there's a kind of dark side to the Neolithic Revolution as well. And to be able to speak to that, I think it's a pretty ironclad rule of human history that things are always getting better and always getting worse at the same time. And I don't think the Neolithic period is any exception. So what are some problems that either come about or become worse as a result of the Neolithic Revolution? So be able to speak to that. All right, finally, Neolithic art. Of course, people continue to create art during the Neolithic period. We see several different kinds of art and architecture, I should add. So, in this class, I'm going to include architecture under the heading of art. And some of the most interesting art that we have from the Neolithic period could be described as architecture. For instance, the temple in Malta, you can find it on Art Across Time, page 44, the Temple of Gigantia. I think I'm saying that right. It's one of 17 such Neolithic temples found in Malta, probably dedicated to some kind of mother goddess. So again, I think this is a good place to pause and just reflect on the significance of the fact that human beings, as best as we can tell, as long as they existed, were religious in some way, recognized some kind of higher power, some sort of superhuman divinity, and tried to, in their own way, worship that divinity, or I should say those divinities, because most ancient peoples were polytheistic. So we have these temples that were built during this time, some of which are partially intact even today, which is kind of mind-blowing. You also read about the megaliths of Northern Europe. A megalith, I mean, literally means big stone, okay? And you read about 3 different types of megaliths, menhirs, dolmens, and cromlechs. Here's a place I'm going to pause and say, the study guide is your friend. The study guide makes a lot of demands on you, but the study guide also shields you from having to know everything. So, you're reading in Art Across Time and you're thinking, oh my goodness, dolmen, cromlech, menhir, how am I going to keep all of this straight? First thing you should do is look at the study guide. Look at this part of the study guide on that reading and see if we ask you to be able to define those terms. And in this particular case, you'll see that no, we don't. We are not going to ask you to define those terms. At which point you can breathe a sigh of relief. Okay, you are not going to have to define those terms. So does it mean you don't need to know anything about those things at all? No. You should be able to say something, to know something about these big megalithic structures that were created all across Northern Europe. One of the most famous of these, of course, is Stonehenge, which is an example of a cromlech, even though, again, you don't need to know that term. It's a pretty late Neolithic creation, so this really comes at the very end of the Stone Age. It was sort of built up over the course of about 1,500 years, so it was very much a work in progress. And famously, it's a mysterious phenomenon. There's still so much we don't know about the technology that enabled these Neolithic people in Britain to create Stonehenge. There's still a lot we don't know about the purpose of it, the point of it. But there are some things we can say with certainty. For instance, the main axis of Stonehenge aligns perfectly with sunrise on the midsummer solstice and with sunset on the midwinter solstice. We're quite sure that there is some kind of religious significance that the building possesses. Perhaps it was meant to facilitate the worship of the moon, so we're a little bit hazy still on some of the details, but I don't think any archaeologist would doubt the religious significance of this. So what do we learn by looking at something like Stonehenge? We learn that Neolithic people were religious, and we also learn, even though we don't know a lot about the specific technologies they used, we have to conclude that this is a pretty organized society that was able to create something on this scale, using materials from many miles away. Some of the rock came from Wales. So we do learn some things from Stonehenge, but certainly there are lots of questions that are still dangling. All right, so this is meant to be a kind of orientation to your reading, and I'm trying to, on the one hand, help you and guide you and sort of point you in the right direction. But on the other hand, I don't want to tell you so much that you don't even need to read. So you need to both watch these videos and do the reading, really in that order, preferably. I think you'll get the most out of both if you watch these videos first and then do the reading using your study guide along the way. All right, well, as always, be in touch. If you have any questions about this video or anything else, email is going to be the best way for you to get in touch with me. All right, have a great day.